My name is Sara Sundman. I'm a Finnish reporter. I work mainly for HBO, which is the biggest Swedish language newspaper in Finland. And I cover a range of topics, but one of them is immigration. So as part of my work last year, I traveled to the U.S.-Mexican border, but I've also traveled to northern Minnesota to meet with the Nordic American communities there. And so I'm very excited to have this panel here today. We have a panel of some very talented Nordic correspondents that I will introduce in just a second. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the brainchild of this panel and the one who put it all together, Laura Feld, here in the I think I speak for both of us when I say that immigration is a very important topic and one that's been at the forefront, certainly in this country, but also in Scandinavia the last few years. And not only is the topic important, but where we get our information and what kind of picture we get, and the media certainly plays a big role in that. But yeah, without further ado, I would like to welcome our first panelist here, who is Fernando Arias, who is the New York bureau chief and U.S. correspondent for Swedish National Public Radio. Welcome.
Yeah, well, thanks for doing this. I've been working here in the US since 2017. Actually, my first assignment was going to Washington and watch the installation of Donald Trump. And it's been a hectic time since. As a foreign correspondent from a small country, you often do a lot of things. I've been covering tariffs in North Dakota, I've been covering civil rights in Alabama, and of course a lot of immigration too. I've been working with the Swedish National Public Radio since 2010. It's almost like NPR. It's built up in the same fashion. We have member stations all over Sweden, and we have a lot of correspondents all over the world. And we have two here in the US, one in Washington and me here in New York. So that's a little bit about me. I'm looking forward to this. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next panelist comes from Norway, Mathias Ask, who's the U.S. correspondent for TV2 Norway. Welcome.
Hello. Hi, everyone. So I work for TV2 Norway, which is the second largest TV station in Norway. Obviously, I've been covering the U.S. for about 4.5 years now, and things really took a turn on November 9th, 2016. Since then, I've covered more immigration. There's been a lot of trips to the U.S.-Mexico border, a lot of trips to El Paso, McAllen. But also, you don't only need to travel to the U.S.-Mexico borders to cover the shifts in U.S. immigration. You find a lot of stories here in New York, particularly with the U.S. Yemeni community, which has been hit hard by the travel ban. And one of the first things I covered during the Trump administration was going to the JFK airport when the travel ban was first implemented, and the pure chaos that followed. So I'm looking forward to a lively discussion here today on immigration with some talented panelists.
Thank you. And our next panelist comes from Denmark, Sandra Brovall, who is the U.S. correspondent for Denmark's largest newspaper, Politiken.
Hello, everyone, and great that so many of you guys have shown up. Thank you for that. I'm Sandra, and I moved here as a U.S. correspondent for Politiken, which is Denmark's biggest newspaper, in August. And since it's been a whirlwind, I want to say, the first thing I covered was the midterms, where I spent a lot of time covering the youth of America, the youngest voting generation, and I went to Georgia to cover someone who was working for Stacey Abrams' campaign. I met with a DACA recipient in Texas. I met with young Republicans in Colorado, And after the midterms, I think that was probably my biggest immigration story, was going to the Tijuana border in San Diego, Tijuana, and covering the migrant caravans. Oh yes, I have pictures from that. Yeah, and so this is from my trip in Tijuana. This is right outside of Tijuana. Some of the migrants from the caravan walking towards, and also getting a ride. Some of them, a family that I was talking to and did a story about. And we'll talk more about that, I think.
Thank you. And then I'd like to welcome our last panelist, Mari Karppinen, who is from Finland and the US correspondent for TV3 News. Welcome.
First we have to say for Finland, right?
Yeah.
Hi everyone. So my name is Mari Karppinen. As you heard, I'm from Finland. I'm the US correspondent for Finnish National TV News. It's called MTV News. And it doesn't have anything to do with music TV. I have to say that quite a lot. I have been here quite a long time already, I think. I have been here almost 5 years. And in that time, I have seen how the debate about immigration has changed a lot in this country. I have been traveling quite a bit, and most of this also like other side of the border and inside of the country. And recently, I had a chance to make a documentary, so like a little longer piece, not just a news story. It's called Trump's America, Nation Divided, and of course, immigration was a big part of that too. Actually, I would like to show you a very short clip about it. I think this clip reminds us pretty well how complex the issue is, especially in those rural communities near the border. So you're going to meet Verlon Jose. He's the Native American leader. Tohono O'odham Nation is the tribe, and they live on the border, actually both sides of the border. And they're suffering a lot. They're suffering because of all different kind of crimes, because of the drug cartel or smugglers and whatever. So they don't feel safe, but they still don't want to have the wall. So let's watch the clip.
Yes, our people live in fear every day. When people right down the road can't sleep at night because not knowing when someone's going to bang on their door in the middle of the night, standing there with a mask, standing there with a gun, saying, give me your vehicle, give me food. That is a psychological trauma that's created among our people. When people around America can pick up the phone and call 911 and have people there in a matter of minutes, we don't have that luxury.
Trump on uhannut ratkaisevansa raja-alueen siirtolais- ja huumekaupasta syntyvät ongelmat massiivisella muurilla. Alkuperäiskansa on muuria vastaan. Se estäisi liikkumista, tuhoaisi perheitä, perinteitä ja luontoa. Näkemyseroa korostaa sekin, että aavikkokansan kielestä ei edes löydy sanaa muuri.
It would have a tremendous impact on us based on that it would be desecration of our land. It would be as if I was to walk into your home and build a wall right smack in the middle of your home, and you couldn't cross from this side to this side. Or put it in your backyard and you can't get to your backyard.
It's pretty heavy to close the border.
You're strong.
Yeah, I tried.
If you work out, huh? All right, let's go.
All right, thank you. Let's get started. Maybe we can move our chairs a bit closer together. So a lot of people might not know what a U.S. correspondent does, so I thought we could maybe start with talking a bit about just generally what you do and how, what kind of reporting you guys do. Maybe, I don't know, Mari, do you want to take this one?
Well, I think I can say from all of us, I guess now we have been doing a lot about Mueller stuff recently, and but like how my basic workday starts. So I'm the U.S. correspondent, so it means like my field is the U.S. And I'm based in New York, so I travel quite a bit. I'm a video journalist, which means my crew is this one, and I film everything what I do. I broadcast a lot of lives. I can broadcast those from New York or in front of the White House or next to the Mexico border. It's digging a lot of information, basically, of course, and try to catch up the events. And the big challenge, I guess, is always the time difference to Nordic countries. For us, it's 7 hours. Some of you have like 6. Like basically the workday might be when you wake up, you're already broadcasting live to Finnish evening news, which is only noon here. And then the last thing you're going to do is actually middle of the night, which is morning news to Finland again. That was maybe, it was too long what I said, right? So
It's fine, thank you. Maybe, what kind of reporting have you guys done specifically when it comes to immigration? What kind of stories have you reported on?
Yeah, I mean, I was showing a little bit of the pictures from that. That's probably since I've been here in August, the most immigration-focused story that I've done, which was to go to the border in Tijuana, or go to San Diego and cross by foot to Tijuana. And it was right after the midterms. I think it was a week after the midterms. And it was the migrant caravans arriving, some of them in Tijuana. And so that was a reporting about the people staying in different shelters, but also people walking there. It was some of the pictures that you saw. They're walking towards Tijuana, waiting in Tijuana, but also one of the big stories I did there was a anti-immigration demonstration by Mexicans in Tijuana, local citizens in Tijuana who, with words like Mexico first, maybe it rings a bell, was demonstrating against these migrants.
What about you guys?
I can also talk about Tijuana and the San Diego border. I was there more recently, actually, a month ago. And I covered a story about a new policy decision by the Trump administration. It's called MPP. It's quite new, actually, and it started off there on that border as a trial thing that they had just there, and now they have expanded it. So what it is that when you seek asylum in a country, normally you will stay in that country during the asylum process. That's not the case in the U.S. anymore, not for immigrants coming from the southern border. Now the authorities in the U.S. can actually make you stay in Mexico during the process, and that creates a lot of problems. I talked to an immigrant from Honduras who applied for asylum in San Diego. She was there for 2 days and was sent back to Tijuana. So the problems it creates for people are several. The first thing is that people might not be safe in Mexico either. They don't have any means of supporting themselves. And in this case, the woman the person I talked to, she was the mother of 3 children. She didn't have any work there, and she didn't have any place to stay. So that's the first problem. The second problem, I would say, is legal assistance. So if you're able to stay in the U.S. during your asylum process, you can get pro bono lawyers to represent you in court, in immigration court afterwards. That's not the case if you're in Mexico. She tried. I actually helped her. But she couldn't get a lawyer while she was in Mexico. And I'm still in contact with her, and she's going to her appointment at the migration court in San Diego tomorrow, actually.
Interesting.
Yeah, I was in El Paso a couple of months ago. I was actually there for a Trump rally, because he was there it was right before he declared a national emergency, so he was there to kind of gin up some support for that. And while I was there, I ended up going to this nonprofit in El Paso called the Annunciation House, which takes in a lot of the asylum seekers and refugees who come across the borders who have been processed by ICE, and now they end up in a denunciation house waiting for either being able to be let into the country or a family member who can help them. And they're a very media savvy nonprofit, I would say, so they actually organized a press conference and had a lot of undocumented immigrants show up. And one of them was a mother who had 2 children who were actually both U.S. citizens, but she had been deported some years ago, and now she tried to cross the border again with her children. And she ended up being detained, and she was separated from her children for about 6 months, something like that, and she'd just been reunited with them the week before I got there. And this is another aspect where reporting on immigration is very challenging, because there's a lot of legal quirks, and because those kids were U.S. citizens, some other laws apply, because they ended up being processed by Child Protective Services rather than the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And what her lawyers told us, her pro bono lawyer, was that had they been processed by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, they don't know if they would have been able to reunite those kids with her mother, or their mother, because they were U.S. citizens, they had certain rights and they were taken care of. So you're obviously, as an immigration reporter, you're exposed to these kind of stories that are very heartbreaking, very complicated to process.
And actually, I could add one example, because you mentioned Tijuana, and you also, and you like basically, it's so complex, everything, like, so I was recently in Tijuana also, I think it was December, and how those migrants, like almost everybody has, so terrible things has happened to them, basically, they did that journey. But they were like so much tension between those groups too. Like, for example, I met this lady, Iris, who was a widow. She also lost 2 sons, 2 brothers, and a cousin. So basically she didn't really have so many things left. And the only hope was, what she was thinking is the U.S. And she was so afraid of when some of the migrants started to, because the conditions where they live, it's not exactly great. You know, the smell of the Tijuana streets are pretty bad. Some locals are wearing masks, and they are really anti-immigrant in that moment when the camps and tents are really in their backyard, you know. So it's complicated. And with Iris, she was not only worried how long she has to wait there in a very questionable situation, but she was also afraid of, because the other people wanted to have the march and protest. They wanted to protest against these conditions they are. And of course it escalated, and that was the day when the US officials used the tear gas against the migrants, because some migrants tried to cross the border. And then I met her before that march and before that incident and after, and she was sure like all her hopes and all the dreams and everything is now gone because the other migrants. So it was very interesting tension also inside of that world they're living in Tijuana.
In preparation for this panel, I read up on a study that said that U.S. media typically portrays immigrants as the way the Trump administration does, so males in detention centers and in custody of Border Patrol mainly. So I'd like to ask you, as a correspondent, you kind of dip in and out of different subjects, and certainly, daily politics takes up a lot of time. So how do you choose what immigrant stories, what topics, what policies to report on, what places to travel to?
Well, if you work with a news channel, a news network, it's kind of have to be related about kind of what's happening. Like the reason why I went to Tijuana in that month, I could have gone earlier, but that was like when the sitting U.S. president was really spreading these conspiracy theories about how Democrats are giving money to those migrants to come, and George Soros and people. So of course I felt like it's my job to go there and talk with those people and show that what he's saying is not true, because of course we can obviously already know it's not true. So that's actually like one, it has to be related to the news cycle in my sense. But it doesn't always, if it's an immigration story, it doesn't always have to be this kind of story. Somebody's a victim, and you know, like coming. I guess that's one problem we can go later. I guess, you know, like what I think we always do the mistake in Finland and in the U.S. as a journalist.
Right, and I suspect all of you guys have also do a lot of reporting on Finns or Swedes or, you know, as well. So I mean, that's kind of part of it. What kind of challenges have you faced, for instance, in finding sources or getting people, you know, within the government to comment, or how do you go about working?
Just taking you up on your first question, or the one you had before, I agree with that. It's hard sometimes maybe just not to portray people as victims when you go and do migration stories. But sometimes, I remember one story I did maybe a year ago where that didn't happen automatically because there are so many immigrants here in the U.S. and with so many stories. I went to Boston and I was covering a story about TPS, that's temporary protection status. Well, I should say something about that. It's some countries like El Salvador, Haiti, where they had natural disasters several years ago, were granted temporary protection here in the U.S. But that was revoked by the Trump administration last year. Several countries, several people from several countries, their temporary protection status was revoked. So I traveled to Boston and I talked to a Salvadoran migrant. She had been living here for 14 years. She was a janitor on Harvard, actually. She was working there, had held that job for maybe 5 years. But she told me something different. Well, being here in the U.S., speaking to other migrants in the U.S., she was a lot more aware of her situation and why she got there. So she actually felt kind of an entitlement of being here because she knew so much about the U.S. history in Latin America and about U.S. intervention in Latin America. Me myself was born in Guatemala, but I lived in Sweden all my life. But in Guatemala, for example, in '54, the CIA helped overthrow a democratically elected government. In '54, you see the same thing in Chile in '73 and in several countries in Latin America. So there are a lot of people I met here in the U.S. who have stayed here for a long time who really feel that the U.S. history gives them some kind of entitlement to be here, and they don't feel only as victims that should be here for humanitarian reasons.
And you're putting their name out there. So obviously, a lot of times when you talk to specifically undocumented immigrants, they do not want to use their full name. Sometimes they may not want to use their name at all. Sometimes they may not want to want you to show their faces. And when it comes to, is it hard to be, I think it's always hard to be a foreign journalist in the U.S. when it comes to trying to find sources, because people don't usually want to talk to you.
Why is that?
Because they don't know who the hell you are.
Yeah, so it's, you know, time is money in this country, you know, like it's a waste of time.
I felt like when, in terms of that, I have conquered or like encountered problems with getting sources, but one of the things that was helpful for me was actually to find sources on Instagram. And so when I went to Texas to report on this young man who was a DACA recipient, so that was kind of like a story about his how he was a very young guy, and he of course couldn't vote in the election, but the midterm election was really important to him because the DACA status was such a big deal, and he felt like people could vote on behalf of him or against him. But him I actually found on Instagram, and that was very helpful with finding very young Americans. They tended to reply back when I wrote them on there. But similar to your the problem with like identifying people. So he was a DACA recipient, but then his family, his mother, was undocumented. So there was some issues there that even though that he wanted to step forward, there was some issues about the story of the mother.
Right. It's also I don't know if this is too inside baseball, but do you guys use fixers? I mean, this is a big country that you're traveling in, and also like, do you need to use translators? How do you work?
When I went to Tijuana, I used a fixer, and then I had a photographer who spoke Spanish because I don't speak Spanish. So that was, at the time at least, necessary to go to Tijuana to have a fixer, a local who knew the city and knew the area, and yeah, so that was very necessary for when I went there at least.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, I speak Spanish. I've been to Mexico maybe 3 or 4 times while being the U.S. correspondent here. But it's not only the language, I think. It's also knowing the city and knowing people there. Though I don't use fixers, mainly because the Swedish National Public Radio don't do that in the U.S. So I agree with it's going to be easier if you go there with a fixer, but while I'm doing stories in Mexico, I'm mainly done it by myself because I speak Spanish.
How do people react? Because immigration is a very contentious topic, and I know personally from reporting on immigration issues back home in Finland that's one of the topics that cause a lot of feedback and even like hate mail. What kind of reactions have you had on your reporting on
Well, 2 days ago, oh maybe, no, it was yesterday, somebody wrote me an email and said I should jump off a roof. So that's kind of the language.
Good that you didn't.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here too. And I don't want to really say like what kind of language it really is, but one thing I've learned since I've been here in 2014, and I already reported immigration stuff then, but of course, time was a little different. But I have learned that the language is getting kind of more vulgar, and it's not. And of course, the language is it's very kind of racist terms, just like bad words, not maybe about me, but in general, and also very stronger anti-woman. And of course, as we know, this anti-immigration attitude and misogyny are kind of connected. And that personally, as a young woman journalist who is in TV, so, and yeah, of course, I should probably mention that 99% of the feedback and the hate mail I get, they are from men.
And I feel that I have, with my colleague in Washington, who is a woman, I actually have that on black and white because she gets a lot more hate mail than I do. I get some too, especially when we write about immigration. And one thing that I feel is interesting about that is that Swedish people who have never set foot in the U.S., but they really, the ones who writes me emails when I do immigration stuff, they really like Trump, and they don't have any connection to the U.S., but it's kind of a symbolic appeal that he has to people in Sweden who feels that immigration is something that they care about a lot.
When I wrote about immigration in Tijuana, for instance, I didn't really get a lot of bad feedback. One of the things I did notice was that it was, from the other stories in that series about like the millennial generation of the midterms, it was the least read. And we have some statistics showing that articles with brown people are not as clicked on as articles with white people. So people don't necessarily want to read about brown people in Denmark, apparently.
All right. That's interesting. What do you think that, you talked about the reaction, or that there are people who haven't necessarily even been here but have a lot of opinions about politics here. What kind of picture do Scandinavians, Nordic people, have about immigration in the U.S.? Like, what do you think?
Well, I think the image that people have of the U.S. in at least Norway is still very positive, and obviously the link is sort of It's weaker now, but of course, back in the day, everyone had like an uncle or a cousin who immigrated to the United States. Like, just look at Minnesota or North Dakota, still everyone there is named like Johansson or Larson or something. But I think it's a little bit what Fernando was talking about, that the immigration debates in both Norway or Nordic countries and in U.S. have become more similar in a very weird way. Trump has a lot to do about it, and I don't think necessarily it's that he sees himself as sort of like the same as the European immigration hawks, but he definitely talks to people who agree with that view. Like, he's like Nigel Farage now just needs to like call one guy and suddenly he's on the phone with Trump. And just a couple of years ago, it was this weird British European Parliament hack. And you know, with Steve Bannon, those kind of guys, even though they're kind of on the periphery now. So when I get like mail from people who want to talk about Trump or immigration, it's because they kind of think that the immigration debate in the U.S. and Norway are becoming more similar. Even when you look at the polls and you see what people actually think, the U.S. is still very much in favor of immigration. I mean, it is still, and you go out and talk to people, they still feel very much in touch with their immigrant roots. Almost everyone has a grandparent or great-grandparent who came from some other place. And even in Norway, when you look at the polls, and I did this in preparation for this, and I was really surprised to see that in the last 10 years, opinion hasn't really shifted that much. And it's about like more than half think of immigrants as a good thing, and about a third thinks it's a bad thing. And when you think about everything that's happened in Norway in those 10 years, not only the refugee crisis, but the horrific terrorist attack by a white supremacist in 2011, what I think has happened is that there's an intensity gap where those who really, really dislike immigration, they care about it so much, they go out and they vote for it. If you favor immigration, maybe it's not your top issue, maybe you care more about education and healthcare, and I think that explains why, since 2015, the debate, the political debate in Norway and the political parties have moved so far to the right on immigration compared to what they were before.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it gives me the opportunity to pivot kind of to Scandinavia. You talked a little bit about the situation in Norway, but maybe all of you guys could talk a little bit about what the immigration discussion is in your countries and what the current situation is.
Yeah, we recently had an election in Sweden, and the populist party, which is called Swedish Democrats, they moved forward, which they have done in the last two elections too. I think they have somewhere around 17% of support in Sweden, which is in Europe it's quite it's not that much actually if you compare to other European countries. But I think the large debate and the large shift in Sweden was in 2015, and you touched on it, the refugee crisis or the humanitarian crisis in 2015, where Sweden had 160,000 asylum applicants in 1 year. That is quite a lot for a country with 9.5 million inhabitants. Especially if you compare it with other countries. And that's because Sweden had what you call generous asylum laws at that time. But since then, there was a big debate in Sweden. There was a lot of media attention in Sweden on asylum, on the rules that Sweden had. And it was changed. And we actually have the same process that Mathias was speaking about, that several of the parties that are not considered populist or far-right parties in the Swedish parliament are now pivoting, are now adopting the same policies as the populist party. And the asylum laws in Sweden looks a lot more like their European neighbors right now, which is a lot stricter. And this has changed Swedish politics a lot, and it's still changing the parties as we speak today, because now, just to give you an example, a week ago, the Christian party in Sweden are now saying that they're going to cooperate with the Swedish Democrats, the populist party in Sweden, which is a big change. We see that the Swedish Democrats are actually being invited into rooms where they were not invited at all before.
Yeah, and I think of the Nordic countries, for sure, Denmark has the strictest immigration laws, and so our move to the right politically started a lot before 2015. It escalated some in 2015, but this was a debate and a move towards much stricter immigration policies for at least 10 years. We also have a equivalent to the Swedish Folk Party is a Danish Folk Party, and they sort of started that movement, and since then it's been sort of a competition of who could become strictest, to a point where now the latest, you could call it kind of a paradigm shift in Danish politics, which is that now it's confirmed that it's gone from assimilation, that was used to be the goal of immigration, but now it's not that anymore, it's sending back. So that's like the last of the very, very strict rules, and I guess we also had a recent policy that also got some attention here in the U.S. where it's sending migrants to an island, a deserted island. Yeah, so it's very strict rules in Denmark at the moment for immigration.
Well, we actually have a pretty crazy immigration debate happening in Finland. One reason is, of course, elections are coming up next month. And also, we already had this party called True Finns. It's kind of the same like Swedish Democrat and stuff. They have been in our parliament like several years, and they have been pretty powerful, really. But now we have another one. They're called Blues, Siniset, and one of the slogan for the election is like Secure Finland, and it's very anti-immigrant rhetoric and all the stuff, and already like people, the middle class, feel you don't have enough resources, and of course it's always immigrants' fault, they think. And so in my hometown, which is called Oulu, it's north of Finland, it's one of the biggest cities in Finland, but maybe comparing to US cities, it's not exactly very huge. And there was very, very unfortunate event that there was some immigrant background men were abusing Finnish young girls. And you can imagine what this kind of thing, what kind of influence it had already to this very, very hot topic. And now the recent polls, you can see, I think it was 52% of Finns thinks we have too many immigrants already in our country. And what we have, if you count basically everybody, like foreign-born people, it's less than 400,000. It's like around like 7% of the whole population. But because, of course, like if immigrant does a bad thing, like something unforgivable, it kind of gets more attention. Also in Finland, like we have learned also in the US, if you watch, especially certain news outlets, like that's the attention they get. So it has to be very, very, very nasty conversation, and it just basically, you need like you need few bad immigrants to do something, and then everybody has a stigma after that. So that's kind of the situation in Finland right now.
Yeah, the situation in Norway is a little peculiar because the populist, most immigrant skeptic party is actually in government, and they've been in government since 2013, which means there's no one in parliament really to attack them from the right, except for their own backbenchers, which they do. And what that means is that in 2015, when the refugee crisis happened, they weren't really in a position to grow from that the way the Swedish Democrats or DF or someone else was. And right now they're not doing that great in the polls. They're around 10-11%. The elections are still 2 years away. But I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens to them if they lose the election in that coalition breaks apart, because they're the junior partner in a 4-party coalition. And if they lose, maybe they'll get a new leader. They've had the same leader since 2006. And there's a lot of people waiting sort of behind the scenes and hoping to maybe take this party in a much more like anti-immigrant direction than they've been able to do in government for the past 6 years.
just a quick note on the difference between our countries, I think, and the populist parties in our countries, because you hear my colleagues speak about that the immigrant skeptic parties in their countries, they are either in the government or they are bigger than the Swedish Democrats. And I think there is a big difference with Sweden, and that is that the Swedish Democrats, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the only party which have Nazi roots, clear Nazi roots. In the 90s even, they were marching in the streets of Stockholm with swastikas and Nazi flags. That is the same party that is now in the parliament in Sweden. So other parties in Sweden have had a lot more reasons for not cooperating with the Swedish Democrats than maybe our Nordic neighbors.
Hey, Fernando, I'd like to ask you, because President Trump a while ago, or a few years ago now probably, brought up Sweden as a kind of example of liberal immigration policies gone wrong, and still it's kind of brought up in certain groups here as, so how do you react? What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, it was a huge news story in Sweden. This was during a campaign event in Alabama when Trump was down there, and he said, "Did you see what happened last night in Sweden?" And every journalist, I think, were like, what happened last night in Sweden? And that was the answer, because nothing had happened. He had watched something on Fox News, I think it was, the segment, and he mixed it up. And they were in Sweden, but it didn't necessarily, it wasn't something that had happened that last night. So he just said that, and then, well, yeah, all hell broke loose on Twitter and stuff. So I think it depends on also who you speak to here in the U.S. We touched upon this before. It's quite polarized in Sweden, but it's also polarized, the image of Sweden in the U.S. depending on who you ask. So some people on the right would see Sweden as the way Trump wants to portray it, like this immigration mecca, and that creates a lot of problems. And some people on the left, if the people who know what Sweden is, would maybe think of it of a country that has sort of free healthcare and free education and that kind of stuff. So it depends a lot of who you're asking.
The kind of stereotypical take is that, you know, the U.S. is a country of immigrants, and whereas like all the Nordic countries are very homogenous and white. What do you think that people here are getting wrong about, you know, immigration in Scandinavia, and conversely, what are people back home in your countries not understanding about the situation here?
I get a lot of people ask me time, like, so is Norway all white? And some people are very excited about it, and some people are just like, hey, like, calm down. Like, you're excited for the wrong reason, pal.
Well, for me, like, for a person from Finland, usually, when I make the first phone calls, you know, maybe, you know, wishing to have a good interview with, you know, introducing myself, I'm Mari Karppinen from Finland. From where? You know, then I have to usually start explaining where Finland is. I say it's between Sweden and Russia. And then they're like, oh, okay, cool. That's the thing. But yeah, I have had the same kind of comments. People, like, especially you go somewhere in Midwest, they're like, oh, Finland must be, you know, you must have nice there, you know, like. And it is really something about the white skin kind of comments. So yeah, but it's true. Finland is pretty white. Like, we have, of course, migrants, but not so much.
What do you think the press is getting wrong? I guess, well, I mean, we're all part of the press, so.
Nothing.
But if you, you know, all of you follow the U.S. media, what do you think they are kind of getting wrong when it comes to immigration here in the U.S.?
Oh, but that depends so much which TV news, for example, you watch. Like, in the same day, if you don't know better, if you watch Fox News and CNN, it's really, it's different stories. Like, it would be from a different place. And so, as we know, Fox News is very anti-immigrant, and as I mentioned earlier, like if like when I was, for example, filming this documentary and I was in deep Oregon, they didn't talk about the Russian investigation. They didn't care about anything else. The only thing they were talking about was this crime this one migrant did somewhere in that state, and that was the main news at Fox News all day long. And then if you switch to the CNN or whatever other news outlet, you know, maybe it was, no, it wasn't even mentioned there. So it's kind of it's so divided, and it's basically the realities the news outlets want to point out are so different. There's no like really like one what is wrong or what is right. It's kind of it's sometimes it's really really absurd in my opinion.
I would also say that.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just saying that it just seems like there's different facts for one TV station and another, which has
no facts.
But just focus on different stories, and very different stories, and focus on what they perceive as different facts. And I think that's a big difference between the media environment here in the U.S. and the media environment in Denmark, and I think also the rest of Scandinavia, that we don't have that. We don't have, you can't click from one TV channel to the next and see the world completely differently. That hasn't happened in Denmark.
Like, I'm sure, like you guys, if you have a news anchor, so you have evening news going on, it's not kind of in regular basis, the news anchor is not giving his or her own opinions on the table, but here it kind of is. And of course, regarding this kind of sensitive matter, like immigration, it's kind of dangerous in a way.
I would also say it's very much a question not just left to right, but also the national and the local level, which I think is becoming more and more important as we see a lot of the local papers and even the regional papers in the U.S. disappearing. Because you notice a lot of the immigration debate in the U.S. comes out of Washington, and when you go to the border and you sort of start asking those Washington-centric questions, they don't even understand the question. It's like you either like, are you like, do you want a wall or do you not want a wall? And they're like, well, you know, we need some protection. So you want a wall? Like, no, because you can't physically build that wall because there's private land. The geography doesn't allow it. So you know, when you go to the border, like the Republicans start sounding way more, I guess you want to call it immigrant friendly or anti-wall than the Republicans in Washington. But the Democrats also sound a little bit more pro border security than they would in, you know, speaking in the U.S. Senate or U.S. House of Representatives.
I would only add that I think sometimes the Trump administration and the news coverage of the Trump administration has created a somewhat ahistorical coverage. Sometimes I think this might apply also to immigration, but I'm going to take another example. You all remember the murder of Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist in Turkey. And this was in Sweden and here in the U.S., and rightly so. It was condemned, and it was covered in, of course, the way it should be. But also when you speak, about when the coverage came to the Trump administration and what it should do to punish or to answer what had happened there, there was a lot of criticism, and I think that was rightly put. But one thing that I miss is that this was not the first time that Saudi Arabia committed abuse against human rights. That had happened during the Obama administration before that. And I think I might offend somebody in the audience, I don't know, but I think that sometimes the media in Sweden and the media here in the U.S. take some cheap shots on the Trump administration, which they wouldn't have maybe against the former administration. And that is something I've seen.
The floor for some questions in just a minute. The topic of immigration is often framed in media as well as a security issue, and it certainly is. But do you guys believe that the media has a responsibility for the public opinions about immigration?
I think so. I mean, I can only touch, I don't know the statistics for this in America, but I know them for Denmark and Danish media. And recent studies have showed that that came out was like the people we talk about, and it was how migration was covered in Danish media, and it was very much like stories about problems or stories about the scarf of women wearing a scarf or not, or why were they wearing a scarf, or should they wear a scarf at work, or were they being were women, for instance, being controlled by their husbands and so on. But this study shows that there's not very much just speaking with people with immigrant background as sources in Denmark. It's like really minuscule. So when there's a story about, I don't know, raising electric bills or something like that, it's very rare that Danish media call the family of Mohammed and talk to them about how is it for you that your bills have gone up. So there is a portrayal, at least in Danish media, about immigration and immigrants being trouble and not being portrayed in anything else than that.
Yeah, and I could add, like, that's kind of, it's important to remember us as a journalist when we work. It's not only tell a story about that Iris, the asylum seeker, but also like, well, recently I visited this little town in Pennsylvania, Kennett Square, I believe was the name. They called themselves the mushroom capital of the world. They basically produced most of the mushrooms ever. It was a very cute town, but that town is very, very dependent on immigration, and actually undocumented ones, because not so many people don't want to do that. Mock farming, they're very interesting mushroom factories where they are. And actually that owner of this one farm where I went, he was in the trouble because many of those undocumented immigrants, because Trump, as we remember, promised to deport all of them, they actually just disappeared. They didn't come to the work. Even as we know, some of those undocumented workers, they pay federal taxes and stuff, but still they were afraid of that ICE would come and take them. So he was actually lacking of workers, and he couldn't find from local to do want to do, they wanted to do something else. So that's kind of important story to always remember. Like they are important sources to immigrants.
Is there one final question for me? Is there anything that you think Scandinavia or the Nordic countries can learn about immigration in the U.S.? Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there. But it's more like a positive end.
Well, I hope this is not too corny, but one thing I have learned living here almost 5 years is that even you guys don't have the best healthcare system. You don't have the best social security network and stuff, but still, damn, people try, and they have amazing attitude, and they don't kind of quit. And maybe very often people work too hard and all the time, and they don't have the famous 5 or 6 weeks.
7.
Oh, 7? You guys have 7? Okay, vacation a year. But still, people kind of try, and at least they seem happy in their own way, and it's sometimes I feel like in Finland, even, I know we're the happiest nation of the world again.
Well, that was us.
Oh, sorry, dude. so still, I don't know, is it because we have the great system around us, supporting us? Sometimes maybe we feel like we don't have to try so much, that kind of drive that Americans have, it's amazing. And I'm not saying I don't hope you guys get better healthcare, but I'm saying that's something amazing, and that's one thing I think we could learn in Finland.
Yeah, I think there's no denying that the U.S. is still incredibly welcoming to immigrants, especially when you just go to the local community, even people who, it's weird, even people who might not be that inclined to support more immigration policies are still very friendly to their Syrian refugee neighbor, because they live in my community and I have to support them.
And I think that depends a lot on where you are too in the U.S. Here in New York, it's definitely like that, and that is something that I have noticed too, that I think maybe Sweden can learn something from that, especially here in New York. Let me put it like this. In Sweden, if you are segregated, it means that you live somewhere outside in the suburbs in Sweden. And here in New York, it's not always a bad thing to be segregated geographically. People have their communities, but if they have work, if they have means to, if they can earn a salary, and if they can access the job market, they may have their segregated community and they may speak their language, and that's okay. That's not quite how it works in Sweden. In Sweden, people think of integration to something closer to assimilation. If you are to be considered a Swede, you should speak the language and you should know the customs in a way that's not how it works here in New York. And that, I think, is something that Swedes can learn from the New Yorkian experience, that you can actually be who you are, speaking your language, and still be a New Yorker.
And to touch on that, I think that's true. I'm married to an American, and we lived in Denmark together 7 years before we moved here in August. And I think one of his, it's not like a scientific study, but one of his things was that he said Danes always have so many stereotypes about other people, even like the Swedes, you're kind of prudes, right? Like not like us, who are like you know, and then you know the Norwegians are have oil money, and you're all like, I mean, we just. But I mean, we're very quick to judge people on stereotypes that I think here in America people wouldn't be so quick to jump on those stereotypes. It's not a scientific study, but that's what I've noticed here, and I think that's wonderful here in America, that people are not subjecting people to stereotypes as much as in Denmark.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you. I know we've only like scratched the surface, but I really want to give people an opportunity to ask questions. So, oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, I don't think we have a mic to go around, so if people can just shout out their questions. In the front row there.
Yes. So immigration has been an issue in the United States for a very long time, but it seems that in 2016, that election, it erupted as the preeminent issue. Why do you think that is, or that even was the case?
I'm sorry, the question, why that became the major issue?
Yeah, why did that seem to supersede things like the economy and counterterror, which was everything for the past, 16 years? And then all of a sudden immigration in 2016 seemed to really become extra important.
Well, the one candidate was very loud and talked about it a lot. And he did pretty well, so by the way. No, but I think, well, one reason, there are several reasons, but one reason which is kind of the same thing what is happening in Nordic countries, I feel, it's how so-called regular people, the middle class, who has in the end all the power, if you really think about it, they are not satisfied. They understand actually how much I work, whatever I do, I cannot still buy this house like my great-grandfather did. The value of my money is not the same. And then maybe they don't think, oh, wait, is actually whose fault it is? Is it that 0.1% who is just getting more rich? Or is it actually those immigrants who look different than I do, and they actually speak Spanish? So I think that's kind of thing. And then if you have a very loud candidate saying like Mexicans are rapists and they come here and take your jobs, it's kind of then it's easier to support that. That's one reason, but there's several.
And I think he definitely sort of hijacked the Republican Party, where he really saw where the opinion, like the grassroots of the Republican Party was, and the if you want to call them the elites, or especially party leadership like Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan. They really thought that, immigration reform is something people want, and, the Fox News viewers said, we don't want that at all. And I think also, especially the wall became such a powerful symbol for his base, and it also became about not just immigration, but particularly in the Midwest, it became about the opioid epidemic, where when he talked about let's build a wall and stop the drugs. If you were on the left, maybe you saw that as a racist policy to keep, Mexicans out. I think a lot of people in the Midwest didn't see it as that. They saw it as someone who's going to try to rebuild their communities. And I think really the Democrats to some extent were blindsided by that.
And all those little towns, which I'm sure you also visited during the campaign trail, they are basically very sad place because maybe they had a gold mining something, and maybe they had some kind of factory, but they all are gone, and usually it was pretty much white men and women walking there, and sometimes in trucks, and they wanted to blame somebody, some people, and immigrants is kind of easy target in that sense.
I also think that right now he knows that this is working. The president knows that this is working, but in some groups of the electorate, and he creates different crises, and he creates stories for us to pick up on, so that there is a lot of media attention to migration. And that is a parallel to what happened in Sweden in 2015, actually, because there was a lot of stories also that were positive about immigration, people who came to train stations and helped immigrants coming into the country. But all that fueled the populist party in Sweden, and I think that Trump bets that this will work in this election cycle too, to make a lot of announcements like the one that I started off with, the MVP at the San Diego border. He wants a lot of media attention because he tries to portray himself as the only hard on immigration candidate, and he bets that will work this election cycle too.
All right, other questions? Thank you. You at the back there, the door?
Have any of you studied or written about crime rates amongst immigrant populations in your own countries versus the overall population? Here in the U.S., there's a lower crime rate. At least I've seen that cited and read that cited. There's a lower crime rate amongst immigrants, illegal or not, than the general population. But of course, we have a high crime rate in this country compared to most countries. Have any of you written about the crime rate, arrests or reported crimes involving illegal or legal immigrants, non-nationals in your countries, and how does it compare?
I haven't written about it, but there is still a big debate on it in Sweden, and I think that the media in that time, in 2015 and 2016, debated that question a lot. And there are not a lot of studies on it in Sweden, but one problem for the media was that if you do that analysis, if you look at the studies that exists, you get that immigrants have slightly larger crime rate than Swedish natives. But that doesn't control for the lack of education, the class. So you see that in Swedish people too, Swedish people born in Sweden, that if you don't have education, the crime rate among that group will go up. So if you don't control for that, a lot, according to a lot of scientists in Sweden, it's not worth anything.
Well, that was actually, it's right now a very big debate in Finland, because as I mentioned what happened in my hometown, they were men from Iraq originally, and they abused those Finnish girls. So of course then all the Finnish press were starting to dig all the statistics. And it's the same thing like here, the most of the crimes, whatever is the crime, is done by so-called natives, like the Finns. But then the problematic for this immigration conversation for immigrants was that they kind of found out that if you talk about rapes, that certain nationalities were kind of over, like the number were actually higher comparing how many those people we are. And of course that gave so much fuel to the anti-immigrant parties to the conversation. So that was kind of the recent news I have read from the news, but I haven't covered it by myself because I'm here.
Thank you. You over there? Yeah.
So since you're all from not from the U.S., what does your perspective on covering immigration stem from, since you guys are from other countries? Like, you'll have to deal with visas, you'll have to deal with, working, back in your homeland. How does that frame when you guys are actually talking about things like immigration, since you're personally have experience with yourself?
Well, I think anyone who's been through passport control at JFK can say that the border is definitely not open.
Well, yeah, every time when Trump is talking about, for example, making some kind of visas more difficult for immigrants, of course I'm always interested about it. I've been reporting about it too, because there are this called talent visas. We know there might be some talented people coming from Nordic countries too and using that. Personally, I don't know, I have a media visa. I have to renew it every 2 years actually, and so I have experience about that process. But I can say it was kind of easy for me. I'm coming from Finland. It has a very good reputation in this country. It would be different if I would be from Yemen, for example, for sure.
Well, to me, it's more personal, I think, because I'm myself an immigrant, not only to the U.S. but to Sweden too. Just to share a small story with you, I went to Juarez a couple of months ago, and I met this Mexican woman. She had 1 kid or 2 kids with her, I think. And she told me she was poor. She was extremely poor, and she told me she was going to apply for a visa in the U.S. And I knew at that time that just being poor, that doesn't give you any right to get asylum in the U.S. or any other country for that sake. I didn't tell her that when I interviewed her, because I didn't know if there were any other circumstances that she could get actually receive asylum in the U.S. But that actually reminded me of my own situation, because I went back to El Paso, and I went walking on the bridge and showed my Swedish passport, and I knew that she was going to go do the same trip 2 days later, and she was probably not getting in. So, of course, there is always, when I go to Mexico and when I talk to Central America, it's somewhat more personal to me, if you know what I mean.
I think the experience that I have had been the contrast of bringing my American husband to Denmark and then coming here. It was I wouldn't say it was too difficult, because I was luckily a person of privilege, so I could show that, for instance, that I didn't live in a ghetto environment, as we call it in Denmark. It's like the official definition. So when he came there, to Denmark, I had to show that we didn't live in a ghetto, and I had to have a certain amount of money on my bank account, and so that the social services and so on, that I could support him if he wasn't in a job. And I also even had to not have been on social welfare in a certain amount of time. I also had to provide documentation about how big my apartment was. I had to be above 24. And luckily I had all those things to provide, but if I hadn't had one of these things, he couldn't actually have been coming to Denmark. And that's very different here. I haven't really used it here because, we got married in Denmark. We always call it our visa marriage. It's for love, I promise. Coming here, it was very easy. First of all, because I had a media visa, so it didn't really. But if I did not have had a visa, it would have been super easy for me to come here. I wouldn't have had to show all these. He hadn't had to show all the things that I had to show for him to move to Denmark.
Interesting. Thank you. Other questions? The lady at the.
I feel like you guys have covered immigration in regards to South America and how it affects, I suppose, and influences your countries. I'm wondering about the Syrian refugee crisis that is happening right now and how it is affecting your countries in regards to immigration policy, but also mostly social and economical changes that might be happening, and what kind of work you might be doing in order to facilitate a more inclusive environment for both here and over there.
Well, because of the Syria war, we also, I'm sure we all got more migrants, and after that, there was of course a lot of discussion about immigration, and our government changed kind of the system a little bit, like what kind of benefits all asylum seekers can really get. So we, like, basically our government provides the basic health care, you know, the kids can go to school, and they have a housing, and they can go work after 3 months, or if they don't have any documentation, then they have to wait 6. But they kind of made some kind of cuts, you know, because the amount we got suddenly, like 6,000 more people that we usually have when the Syrian war started. So that's why they did some decisions to save money for the system. But still, you know, the basic benefits for migrants are still there. But that kind of change happened.
Yeah, Norway actually took in not as many as Sweden, but still a lot of refugees during the in 2015, especially since a lot of them, Norway was one of the sort of entry points into Europe, kind of, because they would come in, they'd go all the way through Russia, and then they'd cross the Norwegian-Russian border at a place called Storskog, all the way up north, and then, because of this weird thing, they couldn't cross it on foot, so they would get small bikes on the Russian side, and they'd bike across a bridge, and then they just throw the bikes in a river or something. Right afterwards, and as I mentioned earlier, like the anti-immigrant parties in government, so all the parties kind of in parliament kind of got together and came up with this deal. I think it ended up being like 8,000 refugees over a certain number of years, which isn't a lot, but when you're a country of about 5 million people, you can say that, well, compared to the population, we're taking in a lot, which is what they said when, you know, when the UN High Commissioner for Refugees or someone else would say, Norway, please take in more refugees, and, or even Barack Obama said it, and then, or he's kind of made a more general point, and then then Norway could point to the US and say, well, you guys may be taking in 10,000, which is more than we do, but you're a country of over 300 million people, we're a country of 5, so don't talk to us. You know, that's basically what they said.
All right, I think we have time for one final question.
I've worked in the immigration field for 35 years, and I'm always shocked at how when reporters write their articles about U.S. immigration law, they make mistakes, and they don't bother to check with a U.S. immigration lawyer. And I wonder if any of you ever do, you know, call up a U.S. lawyer who specializes in immigration and run your story by him, or to see if you're talking about the law accurately.
Well, I have personally interviewed a couple of immigration lawyers during the years, but I'm sure I have done some mistakes. I'm sorry.
I think it's a good and valid question, and I usually, when I do immigration stories, I usually start with immigration lawyers, and I interview them about the main, problem if they see it that way. I don't think immigration lawyers would be up to actually looking at my story when it's finished, just to correct it for mistakes. But I just want to say that I usually start there. But when it comes to, and we talked about this before, I think, when it comes to actually having sources in government, for example, DHS, that's actually quite hard for a reporter being from a smaller nation. We not only sources, anonymous sources that would give us stories, that would almost never happen, but yes, to get through to somebody at the communication headquarters at DHS, it's really hard to get something, to get some information from them, because they don't really prioritize a journalist from a smaller country. But I agree with you that immigration is something that we're not experts on, and sometimes I'm probably just like you. I get it wrong, but I think we all try our best not to do that.
And of course, there's the issue, and you're completely right. When, for instance, when I went to Tijuana, it was because there was a lot of things going on, like how it is. You say you cover the news, right? And you're on the ground and you're covering what's happening there, that is a really, I think, a time when news is happening and you're covering that. But I think it's important to also try and do the stories after, and definitely we could get a lot better at that.
All right, I think we need to wrap up, but there's a reception now, so I would encourage you all to continue the discussion over some wine and other refreshments. Thank you so much for being here.